The rain poured relentlessly, drenching the empty streets in a cold autumn embrace. Daniel pulled his coat tighter around him as he hurried home, the wet pavement reflecting the dim glow of the streetlights. His mind was preoccupied with the mundane worries of the day, an endless cycle of work, bills, and loneliness. He sighed, kicking a stray pebble as he turned the corner to his apartment building. That was when he saw it. A small figure curled up near the iron gate, shivering in the rain. A dog, its fur matted and soaked, its eyes barely visible beneath the tangled mess. Daniel stopped. The dog lifted its head slightly, ears twitching, and their eyes met. There was no desperation in the animal's gaze, no pleading whimper, just quiet resilience, a silent endurance of the cold and the solitude. Daniel hesitated. He wasn't particularly fond of dogs. He had never had one growing up, and the thought of the responsibility that came with caring for a pet made him uncertain. But something about this animal struck a chord in him. Perhaps it was the way it simply watched him, as if waiting for some unspoken decision to be made. He sighed and crouched down, extending a cautious hand. "Hey there, buddy," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the rain. The dog didn't flinch, didn't retreat. Instead, it gave a small wag of its tail, a weak yet hopeful motion. Daniel felt his resolve weaken. "All right," he muttered, more to himself than to the dog. He removed his scarf and gently wrapped it around the trembling animal. "Let's get you somewhere warm." Picking up the dog wasn't difficult. It was lighter than he had expected, its ribs faintly visible beneath its wet coat. Daniel carried it inside, his shoes squeaking against the tiled floor of the lobby. He ignored the curious glances from a neighbor as he made his way up the stairs to his apartment. Once inside, he set the dog down carefully on an old towel, grabbing another one to dry it off. The dog sat still, watching him with those deep, intelligent eyes. It didn't struggle, didn't resist. It simply accepted his care with quiet dignity. "What am I doing?" Daniel muttered as he rummaged through his fridge for something edible. He found some leftover chicken and placed it on a plate. The dog sniffed it cautiously before beginning to eat, slow at first, then with growing hunger. Daniel leaned against the counter, watching. "You're not just some stray, are you?" he mused. "You belong to someone." After the meal, the dog curled up on the towel, seemingly exhausted. Daniel sat beside it, scratching behind its ears absent-mindedly. He had intended for this to be temporary, a warm place for the night, nothing more. But as he watched the dog's breathing slow into the steady rhythm of sleep, he felt something shift inside him. "Guess we'll figure it out in the morning," he said softly. The next day, Daniel made a half-hearted attempt to find the dog's owner, asking around the neighborhood, checking lost pet notices. But deep down, he knew the truth. No one was coming for this dog. Days turned into a week. He tried calling shelters, but each time he hesitated before dialing, the thought of letting go becoming harder with each passing moment. The dog followed him around the apartment, its tail wagging slightly whenever Daniel spoke. It greeted him at the door when he returned from work. It listened when he muttered about his day, its head tilting as if understanding every word. One evening, as he sat on the couch, the dog jumped up beside him and rested its head on his lap. Daniel let out a quiet chuckle. "I suppose you're staying, huh?" The dog's tail thumped softly against the cushion. "All right," Daniel sighed, running a hand through its fur. "You need a name." He studied the animal for a moment. There was something regal about it, despite its rough beginnings. Strong, loyal. "Roy," he said finally. "How does that sound?" The dog looked up at him, eyes bright, and wagged its tail again. Daniel smiled. "Roy it is." And just like that, the stray had found a home. And Daniel, who had once walked through life alone, had found something he never knew he needed, a friend. The days passed, turning into weeks, then months. What started as an unexpected companionship soon became an unbreakable bond. Daniel and Roy fell into a steady routine. Morning walks before work, peaceful evenings by the fireplace, and weekends filled with adventures to the park. Roy proved to be an exceptionally intelligent dog. He seemed to understand Daniel without the need for words. If Daniel was in a hurry, Roy would trot briskly alongside him, never pulling on the leash. If Daniel was tired, Roy would nuzzle against him, as if offering silent comfort. And if Daniel was upset, Roy would simply sit by his side, eyes filled with a quiet understanding that no human had ever given him. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, Daniel returned home, exhausted. His boss had been unreasonable, his workload overwhelming. As he slumped onto the couch, Roy approached, resting his head on Daniel's lap. Without thinking, Daniel ran his fingers through the dog's fur, feeling the warmth and steady presence that had become his greatest comfort. "You know, buddy, you're the best thing that's happened to me," Daniel murmured. Roy let out a soft sigh, his tail thumping lightly against the floor. Their routine continued without fail. Every morning, Roy would walk Daniel to the gate, watching him leave for work. Every evening, he would be waiting, his tail wagging the moment he saw Daniel approaching. It was as if Roy had made it his mission to never let Daniel feel alone again. But life was not always kind. One day, an unexpected event tested their bond like never before. Daniel had fallen ill. It started as a simple flu, but complications led to a severe infection that landed him in the hospital. His absence was immediate and devastating for Roy. Neighbors later told Daniel that Roy had waited by the gate every day, refusing to eat properly, refusing to leave. He would sit there from dawn till dusk, ears perked up at every passing car, his gaze searching for the one person who meant everything to him. People tried to take him inside, tried to feed him treats, but Roy resisted, his loyalty unwavering. 2 weeks later, when Daniel was finally discharged, he felt weaker than ever, his body still recovering. But when he stepped through the gate, the first thing he saw was Roy, thin, exhausted, but still there, waiting. The moment their eyes met, Roy let out a sound that was something between a whimper and a bark. He rushed forward, his tail wagging wildly, his nose pressing against Daniel's hands as if making sure he was real. Daniel knelt down, tears welling in his eyes. "You really waited for me, huh?" Roy licked his face in response, his entire body shaking with excitement. From that moment on, Daniel knew this wasn't just a pet. Roy was family. As the seasons changed, so did their adventures. In the winter, they played in the snow, Roy chasing after snowflakes and leaving behind trails of paw prints. In the summer, they took trips to the lake, where Roy would leap into the water with pure joy, shaking himself dry all over Daniel, much to his mock annoyance. In the autumn, they wandered through golden forests, the crisp air filled with the sound of crunching leaves beneath their feet. Daniel couldn't remember what life had been like before Roy, and he didn't want to. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set, Daniel glanced down at Roy, who was resting his head on his lap. "You know, Roy, I think you saved me." Roy simply wagged his tail as if he already knew. Years passed and life moved forward, but one thing remained constant: Daniel and Roy's unbreakable bond. Their routine was a familiar melody, a rhythm that never faltered. Morning walks, peaceful evenings, shared meals. They didn't need words, their understanding of each other went beyond language. But time, relentless and unyielding, began to leave its mark. Roy's once boundless energy started to wane. He no longer leapt up in excitement as he used to, his morning sprints slowing to steady walks. The once sleek fur around his muzzle turned gray, and his deep, intelligent eyes grew softer, filled with a wisdom that only age could bring. Daniel noticed the changes but refused to acknowledge them. He still whistled for Roy every morning, still expected him to come bounding to the door, and Roy did. He always did. But each time, his movements were just a little slower, his breaths just a little heavier. One autumn afternoon, they took their usual walk through the park. The trees were ablaze with reds and oranges, leaves crunching underfoot. Roy trotted beside Daniel, his tail wagging lazily. But after only a few minutes, he stopped, panting heavily. Daniel crouched beside him. "Tired, buddy?" He stroked the aging dog's back, feeling the rise and fall of his breath. Roy looked up at him, his tail giving a weak but determined wag. He was trying. He was always trying. But Daniel knew. That night, Daniel sat on the floor beside Roy's bed, resting a hand on his fur. "You're not the same young pup I found in the rain, huh?" he said with a small, bittersweet smile. "But you're still my best friend." Roy nuzzled his head against Daniel's leg, letting out a deep sigh as if he understood. Despite his age, Roy never stopped being by Daniel's side. If Daniel had a rough day, Roy would still be there, resting his head on his lap. If Daniel sat outside, lost in thought, Roy would nudge his hand, reminding him that he wasn't alone. One weekend, Daniel decided they needed an escape, a trip just like the old days. He packed a bag, grabbed Roy's leash, and drove them to the countryside, where they had once spent countless afternoons hiking and exploring. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. They walked slowly, Roy stopping often to sniff the air, to take in the world around him. They reached a clearing where a small river trickled peacefully through the rocks. Daniel sat on an old fallen log, watching the sky shift from blue to golden hues. Roy sat beside him, his body warm against Daniel's leg. For a long time they didn't move. They simply existed in that moment, side by side, as they always had. Daniel exhaled, running a hand through Roy's fur. "You know, Roy, I've never really been afraid of being alone. But now the thought of losing you..." His voice trailed off. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Roy let out a soft breath and leaned against him, as if to say, "I'm still here." The sun dipped below the horizon, the sky painted in fiery reds and gentle purples. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the distant rustling of leaves, the rhythmic sound of Roy's breathing beside him. In that moment, nothing else mattered, just the two of them, together as they had always been. The days blurred into years, and Roy remained by Daniel's side through every season, through every storm and sunlit afternoon. Life was simple, predictable, and in its own way, perfect. But time, as it always does, continued its relentless march forward. Roy's steps grew slower, his once boundless energy now reserved for only the shortest walks. He no longer leaped onto the couch in one effortless motion, but instead climbed up carefully, his joints stiff with age. His muzzle had turned silver, his once bright eyes clouding slightly. Yet they still held the same warmth, the same unwavering devotion. Daniel noticed every change. He tried to ignore them at first, convincing himself that Roy was just tired, that tomorrow he would be better. But as the seasons changed, so did the quiet signs of time's toll. One evening, as Daniel sat on the porch with a mug of coffee in his hands, Roy lay beside him, his head resting on Daniel's foot. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues. Daniel sighed, running a hand through Roy's fur, feeling the warmth beneath his fingertips. "You've been with me for so long, buddy," Daniel murmured. "I can't imagine life without you." Roy flicked his tail slightly, acknowledging the words without moving. His breathing was slower now, deeper, the kind of breathing that carried weight, as if every inhale and exhale meant something more than just existing. A few weeks later, the inevitable happened. It started with Roy struggling to stand in the mornings, his legs shaking under his weight. Then he began to eat less, turning away from his favorite treats. A visit to the vet confirmed what Daniel already feared. Roy's body was tired. There was no fixing it, no medicine to reverse time. "He's had a good life," the vet said kindly, "and he has you. That's what matters." Daniel barely heard the words. The drive home was silent. Roy curled up on the seat beside him. When they reached home, Daniel carried him inside, setting him gently on the couch. That night, Roy didn't move much. He lay beside Daniel, his head resting on his lap like he had done since the very first day they met. Daniel stroked his fur, his heart aching in a way he had never known before. "You don't have to fight anymore, buddy," Daniel whispered, his voice shaking. "I'll be right here." Roy let out a soft breath, his tail thumping once against the cushion. The next morning, Roy didn't wake up. Daniel sat in silence for a long time, his hands still resting on the dog's now still body. He had always feared this moment, but no amount of preparation could soften the pain that wrapped around his chest, tightening with each second that passed. He buried Roy in the backyard, beneath the oak tree where they had spent so many afternoons. He placed a simple stone above the grave, carving Roy's name into it with careful, steady hands. For days, the house felt emptier than ever. The silence was deafening. No clicking of paws on the wooden floor, no gentle sighs as Roy curled up beside him. Daniel found himself hesitating at the door, half expecting Roy to be waiting there like he always had. One evening, as he sat by the oak tree, he whispered, "I hope you know how much you meant to me, Roy." The wind rustled the leaves, carrying his words into the fading light, and somehow Daniel knew. Roy had always known. The rain hadn't stopped since Roy had passed away. It was as if the skies themselves were mourning the loss of the dog that had filled so much of Daniel's life. Daniel, too, had not stopped grieving. The house felt colder without Roy's warm presence, his loyal eyes always following Daniel around the room. The silence that had settled in the corners of the apartment was suffocating. Daniel could no longer bear to walk into the living room without expecting to see Roy curled up by the door or hear the familiar sound of his paws patting softly on the floor. The days after Roy's death were a blur. At first, Daniel had tried to fill the empty space with distractions, work, meetings, the occasional evening out with friends. But none of it worked. Every time he stepped through the door, he was met with that unbearable stillness. It gnawed at him, this hollow emptiness, where once there had been comfort. He remembered the first night after Roy had passed, lying awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. He had tried to hold on to the feeling of Roy's warmth beside him, the comforting sound of his soft breathing, but it was gone. Just like that. Gone. And in its place, an aching void. He had cried then, more than he thought he ever would. The grief had felt so heavy, so overwhelming that he wasn't sure how he could continue without Roy. But somehow the days stretched on. Time didn't stop, even if it felt like it should have. Weeks passed, and the apartment remained unchanged, a memorial to a time when Roy had been there, bringing light into Daniel's life. Every morning, Daniel would wake up to the same quiet, a silence that seemed to amplify the absence of the dog who had been his constant companion for so many years. There was no longer the joy of their morning walks, no longer the playful tug-of-war with the old rope in the living room. The mornings felt too long now, filled only with the sound of Daniel's own thoughts, heavy with the weight of his loss. At work, his colleagues noticed the change. The lightness that had once surrounded Daniel seemed to have disappeared. His smile, which had been so easy to come by, had become rare. He had always been a quiet man, but now his silence seemed deeper, more profound. His eyes often wandered, lost in thought, and his mind would drift back to the times he had shared with Roy's, the walks in the park, the quiet evenings at home. But now none of it seemed real. It all felt like a dream, a distant memory that he could barely hold on to. At night, Daniel found himself avoiding the bed. It was too empty, too silent. The place where Roy had always slept, curled up at his feet or beside him, was now barren. The room felt smaller without the dog, as if the very space had shrunk to accommodate only his grief. There were days when Daniel would sit by the window and look out at the streets below, watching people pass by with their dogs, a sharp pang of jealousy filling his chest. How could they just keep going on with their lives as though nothing had changed? Didn't they understand what it was like to lose something so pure, so constant? Roy had been more than a pet. He had been Daniel's best friend, his confidant, the one who had been there through everything. And now, he was gone. Some nights, Daniel would walk to the park just to escape the silence of his apartment. He would sit on the same bench where he and Roy had spent countless afternoons, watching the dogs run around, chasing each other, their owners laughing and calling them. But Daniel couldn't bring himself to smile. He would sit there for hours, the chill of the night air settling into his bones, feeling more and more isolated. There was no one to go home to, no one to share the quiet evenings with, and slowly Daniel realized that he was losing himself too, bit by bit. Time passed, but the weight of Roy's absence never lifted. It stayed with Daniel like a shadow, following him wherever he went. He had tried to fill the emptiness with work, with friends, with distractions, but nothing worked. No one could replace Roy. No one could fill the space the dog had left in his heart. One evening, Daniel found himself sitting on the edge of the couch, staring at the door where Roy used to wait for him. The familiar wag of Roy's tail, the soft bark when Daniel came home, were all gone now. There was only silence, and Daniel, sitting in the dark, holding on to the memory of his friend. He closed his eyes and thought back to the last time he had seen Roy, the last time he had stroked his head, told him that he loved him. "I miss you, buddy," Daniel whispered to the empty room, his voice breaking. He didn't know who he was speaking to, or if Roy could hear him, but the words escaped his lips anyway, and he allowed himself to feel the full weight of his grief. It was raw, unfiltered, and it hurt in ways Daniel hadn't known were possible. He had thought he was strong, that he could handle anything life threw at him. But he had been wrong. Losing Roy had shattered something deep inside him, something he wasn't sure he could ever fix. It was a strange feeling, this grief. It didn't go away. It didn't lessen. It just settled in, and Daniel had no choice but to learn to live with it. Every day he moved through his life, doing what needed to be done, but there was always that ache in his chest, that hole that Roy had left behind. The world around him kept moving. People came and went. Work continued. The seasons changed as they always did. And Daniel, he continued to live, but he did so without the light that Roy had brought into his life. The spark of joy, the companionship that had once filled his days was gone. All that was left was a man who had to keep going, even though a part of him had died with his dog. Some days were better than others. Some days Daniel could almost forget the pain, if only for a little while. But on the hardest days, when the grief became too much to bear, he would go to the park, sit on the same bench, and just remember. He would remember Roy's wagging tail, his soft eyes, the way the dog had looked at him, as if he understood everything without a single word being spoken. And on those days, Daniel would let himself grieve, let himself feel the loss. And then, when the tears had passed, he would get up, walk home, and try to face another day without the one friend who had always been there. The silence was still deafening, but Daniel, slowly and painfully, was learning how to live with it. He was learning how to move forward, one step at a time, without Roy by his side. The world moved on, and so Daniel had to move on too. But he would never forget.